For the people of Georgia, Russia's war in Ukraine looks all too familiar. In August 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, seized control of two provinces there, and then illegally recognized their independence. It was Europe's first 21st century war. Critics say a muted reaction by Western powers may have egged on Putin's aggressive expansionism, including, of course, now in Ukraine. Now, Georgia, much like Ukraine or even Moldova, must navigate very rocky shorelines, seeking entry to Western institutions like the EU or NATO, while also trying not to provoke the Russian bear on their doorstep. Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili joins me now from the capital, Tbilisi. Welcome, Madam President, to the program. Can I first start by asking you, just to give me your analysis of what you must have been watching very closely on your border, what happened in Russia over the weekend? How much of a surprise was it to you, and how much of a threat do you think it really was to Putin?
I think it was, for me, as with for most of the world, a total surprise. Total surprise to see that form of a rebellion against Putin's regime, which certainly has been weakened by this war, but not to that point. Total surprise to see how easily one can cross the border and get into Rostov first and then into other cities and close to Moscow. Surprise to see that this rebellion ends as soon as it has started, as quickly as it has started, without a direct repression, which is totally unordinary for the Russian tradition. It's very bizarre, even that Prigozhin can trust Putin when he ensures him that he will have security guarantees. That has never existed in Russian history. When you are either a rebel or even a war prisoner, it's never forgiven. So what is happening? It's really a happening in Russia today. And then how can you trust Lukashenko to ensure the security guarantees when Lukashenko has a very hard time to protect its own very relative, but its own independence towards the Russian requests that are more and more coming to him, including this latest with the nuclear warheads that are on this territory. So all of that does not look at all like traditional Russia. And I think that we are in this new phase of what has been happening since the beginning of the war that Russia has waged against Ukraine, where Russia really has seen all its game plans defeated one after the other. That is not yet the final military defeat, but everything that Putin has tried to do has not worked or has provoked a totally unexpected reaction.
Okay.
United Europe, united NATO, stronger NATO, EU that is again talking about enlargement that looked like a subject that nobody wanted to come back to. So all the, for Putin, negative results from these different no success in mobilization, Russian army, and of course the Wagner Prigozhin last act of this theater is adding to it. Russian army that is completely humiliated. The generals, I can imagine this Russian traditional army that since the Second World War was considered as one of the major armies in the world and in Europe certainly, now has to count in the Donetsk on Prigozhin.
Okay, Madam President, let me just interrupt you there, because that is a really interesting and valuable analysis. So if all of this is the case, do you in Georgia feel less threatened or more threatened? As we know, and we've been watching, so many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of anti-war Russians have been fleeing to Georgia and through Georgia. But you had your own invasion in 2008, and you still, I think, are concerned about Putin's intentions. How do you feel today about that?
Of course, I mean, one cannot not be concerned, especially when a regime is entering an end period, and clearly Putin is not mastering everything today, and certainly not mastering the war in Ukraine. You can always be concerned about what can be the erratic decisions that can be taken. In our case, at this stage, I do not think that there is a military stress. First of all, because we have a military occupation that is ongoing since 2008 and earlier under a different form since 1991. So two regions are occupied with military bases of Russia. So to say that we're fearing a military occupation would not mean much. But I think that what is happening, and what could happen even more, is that Russia is testing today the resolve and testing what I call a second front of soft power, which is propaganda, which is through these Russians that have come to Georgia that, I will repeat, need to be controlled. We cannot just let whatever amount of Russians come to the territory of Georgia without knowing who they are. Vast majority, as you mentioned, are people that are fleeing today's Russia, so not really pro-Putin population. But when at the same time we know the threats that are used by Russia, saying that Russian-speaking people, if they are not protected correctly, that can be a subject and a reason for support and intervention by Russia. So all of that is this very gray zone that can be used by Russia, which again I don't think has the resources or the wish to test another front to get towards the West in Georgia, but can be testing a soft power policy, propaganda, which after all is the usual instrument of Russia for so many years.
Madam President, part of this started for your country when, just like Ukraine, President Bush agreed to invite them to start the NATO process. What do you think is the realistic future for your country to keep yourself secure and independent? Do you think you have any chance of getting into NATO or the EU as we speak right now?
I think that we have great chances to get into the EU. And we know that the roads to EU and NATO are very parallel, and Georgia has been very active in its relations with NATO, was part of NATO missions very actively in Iraq, in Afghanistan, has had NATO exercises all over these years, despite the fact that we had occupied territories. So our connection to NATO is very close. But today, probably the EU path seems closer because Ukraine has in fact accelerated for the three trio associates and for others probably in the Balkans has accelerated the path towards European integration. In terms of NATO, it's probably more the center will be, especially at the next summit, it will be Ukraine, we all know that, and it will be security guarantees for Ukraine of what type, I don't know. And that's normal. That is what Ukraine deserves today. So there is any form of competition. And anyway, any advancement of Ukraine will in the end benefit Georgia. Mm-hmm. But EU is at a turning point. Georgia needs to get the candidate status at the end of the year. We have been given the perspective, which for Georgia was very important because that meant that geography is no longer an argument to be opposed to Georgia, which it was for many years. The next stage is to get the candidate status. And in this soft war that we have with Russia, of soft policy, soft power, I think the EU cannot afford, and it's a strategic decision, to lose Georgia, to have the Georgian population disappointed again, and to give, in that sense, an easy place to play for Russia. So it is a very strategic decision that has, of course, to take into account the democratic reforms and process, which maybe in the later stage are not as satisfactory as they should be. Right. But those conditions can remain, can be added. There are a lot of possibilities with which the EU can find the right wording and format, but still take the right strategic decision.
All right, Madam President, thank you very much for that. Really interesting. President Zurabishvili from Tbilisi, Georgia. Thank you so much.